Dwight D. Eisenhower is an easily recognized name throughout the United States. Also known as Ike, which became highly prevalent during his presidential campaign as crowds would chant, "I like Ike," Eisenhower created a legacy through his actions that would bring him to be one of the most highly viewed individuals from United States history. Eisenhower did not immediately reach this level of fame. He built himself up from the bottom. Eisenhower from an early age was a leader. He achieved solid grades and participated in school sports. This combination led to his selection for the United States Military Academy at West Point. This is where Eisenhower first met future General Douglas MacArthur. Ike saw little action during World War I, as he remained in the United States, heavily desiring to be placed into the action of the war. This opportunity never came for Eisenhower until 1935, when he went to the Philippines under the control of his former colleague, General MacArthur. In the Philippines, Eisenhower experienced his first feel of power as he worked with MacArthur to create defenses on the island. These defenses were both diplomatic and military-based, giving Eisenhower his first experience in these areas. World War II was beginning in Europe. Eisenhower returned to the United States in 1939. His first year back, he was placed in charge of a battalion of 15th Infantry, giving him his first official leadership position. From here, he quickly moved up through the ranks and eventually was assigned to the General Staff in Washington, with responsibility for creating the major war plans to defeat Germany and Japan. He was appointed Deputy Chief in charge of Pacific Defenses under the Chief of the War Plans Division. At the end of May 1942, Ike accompanied Lieutenant General Henry H. Arnold, Commanding General of the Army Air Forces, to London to assess the effectiveness of the theater commander in England, Major General James E. Cheney. He returned to Washington with a pessimistic assessment, stating he had an uneasy feeling about Cheney and his staff. 1 month later, in 1942, he returned to London as Commanding General of the European Theater of Operations, replacing Cheney, putting Ike in control of the theater. In November 1942, he was also appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force of the North African Theater of Operations. The campaign in North Africa was designated Operation Torch and was planned underground within the Rock of Gibraltar. Eisenhower was the first non-British person to command Gibraltar in 200 years. French cooperation was deemed necessary to Operation Torch, and Eisenhower encountered a preposterous situation with the multiple rival factions in France. His primary objective was to move forces successfully onto Tunisia, and intending to facilitate that objective, he gave his support to François Darlan as High Commissioner in North Africa. Darlan was assassinated later that year and was replaced by General Henry Giraud as High Commissioner, who had been installed by the Allies as Darlan's Commander-in-Chief. Operation Torch also served as a valuable training ground for Ike's combat command skills. During the initial phase of Erwin Rommel's move into the Kasserine Pass, Eisenhower created some confusion in the ranks by some interference with the execution of battle plans by subordinates. In February 1943, his authority was extended as commander of Allied Forces headquarters across the Mediterranean basin to include the British 8th Army, commanded by General Bernard Law Montgomery. The 8th Army had advanced across the western desert from the east and was ready for the start of the Tunisia campaign. After the capitulation of Axis forces in North Africa, Eisenhower successfully led the invasion of Sicily. Once Mussolini had fallen in Italy, the Allies switched their attention to the mainland with Operation Avalanche. But while Ike argued with Roosevelt and Churchill, who both insisted on unconditional terms of surrender in exchange for helping the Italians, the Germans pursued an aggressive buildup of forces in the country, making the job more difficult by adding 19 divisions, initially outnumbering the Allied forces 2-1. Nevertheless, the invasion of Italy was highly successful. In December 1943, President Roosevelt decided that Eisenhower would be the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. In this position, he was given the task of planning and carrying out the Allied assault on the coast of Normandy, codenamed Operation Overlord. The D-Day Normandy landings on June 6, 1944 were costly but successful. Before the initial landing, Ike showed the moralistic side of his leadership.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well trained, well equipped, and battle hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940-41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war, and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
By making statements such as these for what is one of the most infamous amphibious landings in world history, Eisenhower showed that he had no doubts in how his leadership had prepared all of his men. A month later, the invasion of southern France took place, and control of the forces which took part in the southern invasion passed from the Allied Forces headquarters to the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Forces. Many prematurely considered that victory in Europe would come by summer's end. However, German capitulation would not come for almost a year. From then until the end of the war in Europe on May 8, 1945, Eisenhower had command of all Allied forces on the Western Front north of the Alps. He was ever mindful of the inevitable loss of life and suffering that would be experienced on an individual level by the troops under his command and their families. This prompted him to make a point of personally visiting every division involved in the invasion. Ike's sense of responsibility was underscored by his draft of a statement to be issued if the invasion failed. Eisenhower was a man who started at West Point and grew to be the supreme commander of the Allied forces in World War II. His leadership and decision-making during these times helped lead to an Allied victory. Eisenhower had the confidence, motivation, and intelligence to step up to the leadership positions in the war, which ended up being critically important to the success of the Allied forces in Europe.